Back for another screencast on Django CMS. This time we're going to talk a little bit about internationalized apps, app hooked into the CMS, and the kind of things that you need to look out for when you are doing that. So, just off the top, let me just say that internationalizing any Django app is kind of a big topic. There are many ways to do it, many approaches to take. We're gonna be kind of going through something called django-parler, and how it helps you, and also how the CMS already helps you in this endeavor. So the first thing we really let me just say that you may recognize that we are starting with the same application that we had been building throughout the series. There's a couple of differences than where we left off in video 5. Mainly, you're going to see that we now have a language menu. This is going to be important when discussing internationalization, so I went ahead and added it. And you'll see that there is now also a new menu item called Product Gallery, which didn't exist before, and of course we're going to get into showing you how to build that. I've also added the appropriate configuration to make this particular Django project internationalized. And so let's start there. Let's look at the settings that are required to do that. First of all, what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to make sure that you have use I18N or use internationalization is set to true. That's a must. And then you're going to want to also make sure that you have the language cookie middleware installed from the CMS, and you're going to want to probably make sure that the locale middleware, I'm not 100% sure this is required, but I think it is. You're going to want it anyway if you're doing internationalization, so go ahead and add it. So those are kind of the core Django settings changes, and of course this one is from Django CMS. But some other things that you're going to need to pay attention to are this right here. Up ahead, up at the top, we have set a language code. In this case, I'm using English EN. I'm using, throughout this project, I'm using the short form of the language codes, not the longer EN-US or GB forms. That's only because I'm not mixing dialects of a single language, and as far as I know, this is still legitimate and works, and so that's what I'm using. So you need to make sure you have a language code set, and very importantly, you need to make sure that whatever you have set here is available in this list here, and it is, so that's good. In this case, we're going to be using English and French, so that's just for your information. I don't actually speak French, so I will probably pronounce things incorrectly, but it's good for demo. Then we need to add some settings for the CMS itself. So we need to make sure that you have a block of CMS languages. It pretty much duplicates what you have here, but we have some additional flags set, and definitely go check the Django CMS documentation and see what all those mean, and see if they're relevant to you. You will notice that there is each of these lists is is keyed by a number. This is the site ID. So one of the requirements for installing Django CMS is that you enable the contrib sites packages, and that requires then you have a site ID defined. If you have a multi-site installation, you may actually have multiple sites here and multiple site blocks, but in this case we only have the one. And then we need to also, we're going to be using a package called django-parler. So I've already installed that using pip. Basically pip installed django-parler, but you also need to include that as a, in your installed apps as parler. And you need to include this block here, a couple of settings, the default language, kind of repeating what we've already done, but now we're doing it for parler. And you need to, it has its own little block for the languages that it presents. So again, we're kind of repeating ourselves, but it's important because Django, Django CMS, and Django Parler are independent apps. So that's what you have to do to settings. So once you've configured those settings, you'll already have modifications in your project. In particular, you're going to have an extra segment in your URLs, which is going to be the language segment. So all your URLs will have changed, so bear that in mind when you're planning forward. If you're planning to build a project that you eventually will internationalize, I recommend that you go ahead and enable those features immediately so that you don't have changing URLs. There is some logic in the middleware that will redirect, so that if I go to just leadership, it should redirect to the English variant or the default language variant, or it will detect the language from the browser's request headers and go to the appropriate one. But you want to minimize redirects in your project, so you might just go ahead and start with those things enabled, so all your URLs are automatically going to be internationalized. The other thing that you'll notice is that you'll have a language, a couple of language settings here, and that's because of the language settings that we put in for Django CMS. And then, okay, so after you've done all these things, you need to make sure that depending on your project requirements, you're probably going to want to have a language chooser somewhere in your navigation. I'm actually using a customized one. It's got a custom template that breaks it down into a submenu, and I only do that because many of the projects that I work on have limited amount of screen real estate in the menus, and so I put the actual options in a submenu, if you will, beneath the single menu item. The way you do that is I'm going to go to the base template that I've been using throughout this project. You can see by these 4 dots here that these are the things that have changed since I last committed this project. And basically all I did is I introduced this new nav block, and I went ahead and put, this is the existing menu that we had untouched. I think I changed some of the classes, and then I included this other menu, and by menu of course I'm saying it's a list. And that is, the important part here is this language chooser tag, which is part of the menu tags set of template tags, and it is part of the Django CMS implementation or installation. So once you've done that, you will get a language chooser in your views. Now I did also include some modifications to my style sheets. All of this will be available, I believe. Actually this part won't be. Let me know if you need this. Let me just show it to you. So here's my custom template. Basically it's very similar to the normal one, except again I'm burying everything into a submenu, and it's not hard to understand. If anybody needs this, just let me know. Okay, so that's your basic configuration that you need to do to Django CMS and to a certain degree Django. But you remember I've also installed Parler, and now I'm going to use that in my app. So let's go look at my new app, which is of course products. Well, let me show you the app hook. So I've added a new page called Product Gallery, and to that page I have app hooked my products app. So that is now attached to the page, and that gives the normal integration. We've covered how to do that in the first screencast, I believe. So if you're a little bit rusty on doing app hooks, then definitely check that out. But we're going to assume that you know how to do that. So I've app hooked a products app to the products gallery page, or product gallery page, and now let's look at that app. So here it is here in my code base. Much of the normal stuff, we're going to go through them each one by one. We probably don't need to look at the templates. They're very, well, okay, let's look at them. They're very basic. There's nothing special here. I am using the CMS template. I'll call it a trick, but it's really kind of a normal operating procedure now that we covered off in one of the previous talks. I think it was number 5, actually. So that makes things easy. And other than that, these are just straightforward templates. There's nothing special about them. There's nothing that you have to really pay that much attention to with respect to internationalization, except I am using Django's internationalized tags such as trans, the trans tag here so that it will give me the translated version of products from my get text catalog. I don't know, that might be the only one I'm using. Actually, I'm not even using it over here, it doesn't look like. So very simple products, very simple templates, sorry. So not much to consider there. Okay, so the core of any application is going to be your model. So let's have a look at that. In my model, I have basically 5 fields. I have code, I have description, price, name, and slug. Now, these are pretty much normal. We've covered off how to do placeholder fields in the first video, so check that out if you're not familiar with how those work. But one thing of note is that when you're trying, you don't have to translate blocks of text, especially if they have formatting using Parler or whatever. Django CMS will already allow you to use language-specific plugins in a single placeholder. So this particular object, my product objects, will all have a description placeholder field, product description placeholder field, and in each language version of that product's page, I can put translated plugins. So that's already covered, right? The CMS is helping me do that. I don't have to rely on anything third party to get translated blocks of text. I do, however, if I want to have text that is translated and is entered by the operator in the back end, like in this case the name of the product or the slug field for the product, that will go in in this new block here called translations, or the translated fields field. What Parler is actually, this is part of Parler. You can see that translated fields come from Parler. And I also have to extend, instead of models.model, I'm extending translatable model from Parler. This is a convention that was actually set up by django-parler, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. And I think before that it came from Nani, but I actually don't know where this convention came from. Anyway, so django-parler is using many of the same conventions that were already established by django-parler, which is very nice. If you've worked with one, it's more natural to work with the other. But anyway, so the translated versions, the translated fields that you want have to be basically embedded inside of this. And what django-parler is doing behind the scenes is it actually sets up a separate table for translations for this particular model. And it keys them together using a foreign key, and then it kind of hides everything, all that database relationship behind the scenes, mostly. So once you've done this, you'll typically be able to access your object.name or your object.slug with some caveats. And we'll go through some of those now. So once I've done this, I'm pretty much I can go ahead and migrate, schema migration, initial schema, and then do a migration or a migrate of my product, and I'll have a translatable model. So at that point, I'll probably want to create my admin. The admin is very much pretty normal. In fact, I could probably just use the normal, the default one by cutting all that out and just putting pass here, and everything should pretty much work. But I'm being a little bit explicit about where I put things. I like to put my translated fields together so that my translators would know, where to focus their attention and not try to translate these fields. And also, you can't, at least in some versions of Django, you can't. No, I'm sorry, in all versions of Django, you can't use the normal pre-populate fields directive in admin. Django-parler supports this kind of trick here where you basically redefine it in a method call, and then it does all the magic to make it work. So that's something you got to pay attention to. In my case, I want to have my slugs automatically generated from the name field. Both of those are translated fields, so I do have to use this parler trick. So pretty straightforward stuff. Make sure that you are extending from translatable admin rather than just admin.model model admin. And then also, because I'm using a placeholder field in my apps model, I need to include the placeholder admin mix-in in my class definition. So that's pretty much it for admin. Let's see what that looks like. So, first of all, here's what now we haven't actually covered off how we're adding all of this to the CMS, but let me just show you what we have. I have 3 products defined. You can see they have a code, they have a name, and they have a price. This is the list view. Obviously, I didn't design it. It's just, bog standard. If you click on the code, you go to the actual detail view, and in this case, we're showing the same 3 pieces of information again, but we now also have the placeholder field displayed. And like I said before, the placeholder field already gives us the capability of doing translations. You can see here we have an English description, and then if I flip over to French, then we have a French description of the same product. There's a lot of things that just happened here that I need to draw your attention to, so just for right now, notice that the placeholder field has already helped us translate this object. Now the other stuff like this, in particular this and the slug, were not translated by the CMS. They were translated by django-parler. And let's look how that looks. So I'm going to go into the administration. I haven't actually integrated any toolbar hooks or anything in here, or front-end model editing for this model yet, but we can certainly use the administration. So let's pop down to products, and we'll see we have our list of products. Now there's a special column you can add, which is languages, which I've done, and it shows you which ones have translations, which is convenient. Let's click into one, and we can see that we have an admin screen that has tabs now, and it shows us the 2 groups that I specified with my field sets, my non-translated fields and my translated fields. I'm not particularly crazy about the fact that this field set up here is more close to the tabs, and in fact it looks like these are actually translating this part here. But that's exactly why I like to put a heading on the translated field section so that my translators know where to focus their attention. But anyway, you can see that we have the English versions of these fields, and if you click on the French tab, you would have your operators can enter the French versions of the same fields. Now, if I had gone through and translated my admin, my models. Well, I did actually. I use getText to define these. I use the getText lazy to define my everything here, but I didn't actually go through the process of doing the translations and doing make messages and compile messages. If what I'm saying right now is totally foreign to you, you definitely need to read up on doing internationalization in Django. It's kind of beyond the scope of this particular screencast, but here's a starting point. Definitely read it, read all the links here, and go into depth because there's a lot going on and very powerful stuff. But in its core, getText allows you to define a catalog of strings that you want to have translated, and then whenever you present those strings on the screen, if you provided translations in the catalog using the getText tools, then they would appear on screen when you request another language. In this case, I haven't done it, so these field names are still in English, and these ones as well. Wait a minute, you know what? Actually, that's not true. Hold on. Everything is still in English because my CMS toolbar is still in English, right? So if I switch it to French, let's see if I did this correctly. Okay, so no. Okay, so not much of a difference. I don't know if I actually did anything here. Hold on. Save. Oh, I have to refresh. Okay, so now we have a French toolbar, and let's see if I did the getText stuff. No. Okay. So yeah, everything I just said still stands. You have to do the get text stuff in order to get the translations, and I haven't done that. Regardless, you can see that we can now enter in translated versions of our translated fields, and then those will be available to us in our content. So the one that's the most important for the rest of this screencast is the slug. So the slug is, as you well know, if you're a Django developer at all, is that you use a slug to determine a unique part of the URL for a particular object, and that's a very important, plays a very important role in your URL schemes. So first of all, let me switch back to English. Okay, so so here I am on one of my app hooked objects, and you can see the URL here is our first segment is the language code that we requested, and we've done that over here. This is the translated slug of the page that we're on. So in the CMS, when I was setting up the French version of the page, I set up, here's my slug for English, and then here's my slug for French. This is pure CMS, right? So the CMS allows me to translate the slugs of my page, and using the CMS middleware for language cookie manages all that for me. It manages these segments here, and it manages the translated slugs of my pages already. So that's always very useful. So, but when I'm actually in my app hook, nothing is managing, this. Well, actually we are, and I'm going to go into that, but I want you to pay attention to what's going on here. So the slug for any given app hooked object is not only dependent upon the language segment and also the page segment, but finally its own segment, or the slug for that object, right? And different parts of the system are managing that. These two are pretty much managed by the CMS, so you don't have to worry that much about it. But this part here is something you have to pay attention to. So before we get into that, I want to explain also how these language choosers work. There's two that we need to be concerned with. There's this language chooser here, which is a CMS template tag. And basically what it does is it runs through the installed languages from our settings, the languages that we configured, and then it tries to get the current view that we're looking at, and then it resolves the get absolute URL for that view again in the respective language. So so it basically says, okay, here's the English submenu item, and I'm going to link that to the English version of this view's page, right, or URL. So you'll see in my status bar at the bottom of my browser, I have behind this option this view, but in English, EN Product Gallery Basic Widget. And then of course if I scroll over the French version of this, you'll see that it's the FR Galerie du Products, whatever, and then Widget de Base, which is Basic Widget in French. So it's working right now, and I'm going to show you how that works, but I need you to understand how the language chooser here works. And then we also have a language chooser up here. So if you didn't create this, the operators could still switch languages, which is useful for managing your CMS. But it's another language chooser, and it actually works a little bit differently. We have to do something a little bit more to make sure that works. Okay, so let's go right into it. So first thing I want to do is I want to show you how we app hooked. So the app hook here, again, we covered this off in screencast 1, but there's nothing in here is any different than any other normal app hook. There's nothing to do with parlay, nothing to do with internationalization at all. So there's nothing of interest here, except that I am attaching a menu, so that produces this submenu here of the things, and so let's go over that. That does actually have some concerns with respect to parlay and internationalization. So we're going to look at product submenu, which is imported from menu. So that's here. So here we are. It's mostly the same as a normal one. The only difference is this is normal here. The only difference is I added this part here. So what was happening when I used the normal, approach of creating a submenu of objects for your app hook was I was getting duplicates, right? So it was going to my product model and getting all the objects. Well, it turns out that because of Parlay and the magic it does, I was getting two objects each for each object, right? I was getting a French version and I was getting the English version. And that was interesting, but the problem was, first of all, I didn't want the duplicates. Secondly, the duplicates, even though they were in pairs, they were actually all showing up in the current language. There's a couple of reasons for that, but the important thing is we need to filter those out. So I just used a filter on the query set and said, let's make sure that we're only looking at the ones where the translations relation has a field. By the way, this is a field you don't declare. It's automatically given to you by Parlay, where the language code for that relation is equal to the current language. Now, get language is provided by Django, and that basically extracts the current language for this request, and then presents to you the language code. So we're filtering out all the versions of our objects that are not our current language. Now, the other thing I was doing is I'm just specifying a sort order. Even though I'm using Parlay and I'm using code is actually a translated thing, it just works. So order by code happens to just work. I didn't have to do the translations. I didn't have to do it like that. It probably would have worked if, in fact, let's leave it there and see what happens. Nope. Okay. Didn't like it. So let's go back to normal. Okay. So that's all I've changed here. Everything else is very, very much like the one we did in the first screencast, except for product instead of staff. So there you go. That's the menu. Now the next thing I want you to look at is the URLs. So first of all, you'll notice that the URLs are very basic. I have defined in my app hook, this is a sub URL scheme, if you will, that is attached through my app hook into the normal URL scheme. Oh, one more thing I'd like to point out is that in your projects URLs, not the apps URLs, but in the projects URLs, you need to make sure that you're using I18N patterns instead of the normal patterns, because without this, the initial language segment of your URLs won't appear and won't work. So you need to make sure, if you don't have this here, then you won't be able to go to CMS URLs with the language prefix. So that's very important. Make sure you're using that. Anyway, but in this app URLs .py, I don't have to use that because you only use the I18 patterns at the base level of your URL scheme. You don't use it in the includes, and this is an include. Okay, so these are about as simple as they get. These are textbook, simple. Here's a list view. Basically, I'm saying, go to the root of my app hook, and that's going to be the list view. And if I go to, if I have a string of anything before the final slash, then consider this to be a slug and go to the product detail view. So there's nothing really of concern in this file either. There is some stuff, however, in the views to pay attention to, but not in the list view. The list view is about as simple as it gets. I mean, this is essentially just a list view, and I've defined the model as required. Everything else is standard, and it works. And this is a real testament to why class-based views are convenient. The product detail view is also pretty straightforward. I'm going to cut this part out here and show you that the only thing we're really doing is we're overriding the built-in query set, get query set, to do some additional filtering. And much like we did in our menus, we are filtering the returned objects to only the objects that meet the current language criteria, right? So that makes sense. We want to display the product, and we don't want to have, it's normally it would get two products because I have two languages defined, and we only want one object here. So we're going to filter out by things that are not our current language, and this works great. So again, this is very straightforward. I'm not doing anything too special. Now, the other thing I have to do to the detail view is I have to include this mixin, which is provided by Parler, which is Translatable Slug mixin. So make sure you include that as well. Now, the other part that I added here is I'm just basically, and this is a shim as well. If I take out these three lines, it does nothing. It basically just says do whatever the superclass does for get, right? That's what this line says. But I'm adding these three lines here, and what these three lines here say are, get the object using the normal get object method for the view, which ultimately will use this modified query set. But get the object, then check and see if we have a toolbar, and if we do, we want to do something. We want to basically send that object to the toolbar via a method called get set object. So basically, I'm just sending the toolbar a reference to the current object, and that gives the CMS toolbar the ability of saying, oh, okay, I don't want to return the page's URL for the different languages. I want to return this object's URL. So then the CMS will know to go to that object and then use the get absolute URL method on that object to determine where to go when someone clicks a different language. And you can see by looking at the status bar at the bottom of my browser, that's exactly how it operates. It says English and French, but we're really going to basic widget in the French or basic widget in the English, and that's how it works. So there's a lot of reliance. There's reliance on the menus. Sorry, not the menus. There's reliance in Django, in the navigation scheme. There's also reliance in the CMS itself here with this language chooser on making sure that you have a working get absolute URL method defined in your model. And I've kind of skipped over that because I wanted to impress upon you how important it is that you get that right. So let's look at that. So when you're using django-parler, the way you make your get absolute URL language sensitive is you include a with context switch, if you will, and you do the switch language is provided by Parler as a utility, and it's a little context switcher. And basically you send it, the object that you're working with and the get language that we used previously, the same one from Django utils translation. Again, what this is going to do is look at the current thread, current execution thread, extract the language for this request, and present it as a language code, in this case as a parameter to switch language. Now what switch language is doing behind the scenes is it compares the current language that we're running with the requested language, and if they're not the same, it switches temporarily to the requested language so that you can do whatever you do within the body of the with block. And then once you're done, it will switch back to the normal context. Now that's important. You can't just switch or activate a language in any method and leave it because you'll be changing the context of the execution thread. Maybe that's what you want, but 99 times out of 100, you wanted to switch to it temporarily, do some work to get a translation, and then return it to the normal, the context that it was already running on. So in other forms of using translation, in particular Django Havad, you have to do all that manually. You have to check, see which language you're requesting. You have to then compare it to the current language. Then you have to activate the new language, do whatever you want to do, return it into a local variable, switch the context back, and then return that value. In this case, it's done nice and succinctly in just 2 lines. This part here, the actual reverse statement, is uninteresting. It's the exact same one I would use if I wasn't using internationalized models. So Parler has really helped us out here and removing a lot of lines of code um, with its little switch context switcher. I have this comment here because in the documented version and the example provided by django-parler, they show its usage simply like this. And it probably works just fine in most contexts, but I'm finding that in Django CMS, I have to explicitly send it the desired language. Otherwise, I'm not getting the results that we want. So I'm going to leave this comment in here. So if any of you pull down this code from the repo that I'll provide later in the links, you'll remember why we're doing that and why it's different than what's documented at Parler. So I think we've covered off everything. We've covered off admin, we've covered off the app hook, we've covered off the menu, we've covered off models, obviously, the URLs and the views, and the settings that we need to do, and the menu modifications we made. So let's have a look and see what we have. So we have our app hooked. Enter, we have injected a submenu into the menu as part of our app hook, much like we've done with leadership. And I can go to any one of these objects and it will display as normal. The difference being now that I can switch languages and everything still works, right? So I'm now getting a completely new URL with a completely different slug for the same object, and it all just works. The CMS is providing my translations for my blocks of text or my placeholders, and that's lovely. Reduces the amount of concern I have to do with Parler, but even Parler is working brilliantly, providing me not only translated names of objects, but also translated slugs of the same objects. And the CMS is providing me with translated page slugs, and titles in this case, which is providing this and this right here. So all is working pretty well, and I have used this kind of technique in production on multiple occasions, and I've had no complaints. I guess one thing you need to make sure you're aware of if you're going to jump into this is that you need to understand how getText works. And just very quickly, I'm going to tell you at least one tip that I know. When I first started working with getText, I didn't realize that there was anything special about this alias, right? See, we have, getText lazy is a very important call when you're working with getText, and it's a very long string. So it's become kind of convention that you alias it in your import to just an underbar. Well, that's a little bit more than a convention, because getText itself, the way it works is when you're generating your catalog, it scans your code lexicographically and pulls out strings that are inside of calls to the getText method. So you getText lazy, or you getText, or any of the N variants or the P variants or whatever. And I, at one point, thought I could just do my own aliasing and just say something, do something like that. Well, that's normal Python, valid Python, but getText doesn't know anything about my own alias variant. So it skips over the text, the translation keys when I'm building my catalog. So it's very important that you either stick to the convention or you figure out how to tell getText that you've changed the convention. So just bear that in mind. If you alias this differently and you don't get the catalog that you expect, then that's why. Okay. So that's just a little tip for getText. But other than that, definitely want to read up on how to do internationalization from a Django perspective, which is a little bit more than just the Python version of the getText implementation. Django offers some pretty cool stuff. All the lazy stuff is done in Django. It provides you promises, so you can basically realize the translation at a later date, which is pretty nice. Also, it provides translations of not only your in template code and your normal code, but also it can provide translations to JavaScript, which is pretty amazing. And I have done that in the past, and it works brilliantly. It's straightforward, and I don't know what we'd do without it, to be honest. So the other thing you're going to want to read is you're going to read up on how Django CMS handles internationalization. So there's some nice documentation about that. And just in case you're looking for it, in the language chooser section is this bit of instruction here that will explain to you that you need to do what we did in our view, which is to set the object in the toolbar like we talked about. This is something that you're going to want to look for if you have problems with your toolbar language switcher. Okay, but of course read all the rest of what's here in the docs, so that's CMS. And then of course in Parler you're going to want to look at django-parler. You're going to want to look at the examples that they have here. You're going to want to look. They don't have great docs like we have in other places, but they're pretty useful just in the README on the project. In particular, I like to look at the API section. It just quickly shows you all the tools and utilities that it's providing you. And then, of course, it has an example project, which is nice to reference to see how things should work. So in this case, they have a translated article model, and it shows you how they do that, which is very much like I just showed you. Anyway, I hope this is helpful in getting your CMS projects translated. Thank you, and we'll see you next time. Bye.